Hey there, super friends. It's Joey from Last Point Gaming. Today is Monday, January 27th, 2020. How y'all doing? I'm actually homesick from work today, but I have to run an errand since I'm home anyway. I'm gonna go take care of that. So I wasn't going to record today, but then a thing happened, and so now I'm going to record. And, I actually had a plan for a much different episode for today after work, except I ended up not going into work. So, I've, over time, here and there, mentioned about how you should always call a judge if something seems a little hinky, because, you know, there's a difference between making mistakes and purposefully misplaying and passing it off as a mistake in order to try to garner advantage. You know, I think it was a couple of years ago, the one Modern Pro Tour, there was the guy who got DQ'd for trying to respond to the naming trigger on Meddling Mage that was filed into the battlefield. And I've had to explain that particular interaction to opponents many times as a humans player with Aether Vial and Meddling Mage. And the thing is none of the opponents I have explained this to do I think were, like, you know, trying to pull one over on me. The reason this guy got DQ'd and not, say, warned or, you know, just kind of no, that's not how that works, bro, is because it had been determined that he knew full well that that's not how it worked, and was likely hoping his opponent didn't. And that's cheating, you know. Okay, I go. You know, making mistakes is one thing, but when you know full well that what you're doing is not correct, that's not a mistake. That's cheating. And don't get me wrong, we all screw up. We all try to cast cards out of our hands when we have an experimental frenzy on the battlefield and the board state's just a giant mess, and we kind of forget. I have tried to activate an Aether Vial with Karn the Great Creator on the battlefield because I forgot. You know, it happens. We all screw up. But again, it's when intent can be reasonably deduced, because I hate saying intent can be proven, because it's real difficult to prove intent without a direct confession, without the guy saying, well, of course I can try to screw with my opponent and see what they'll let me get away with. No, friend, you can't. But anyway, so I've generally encouraged that if an interaction doesn't feel right, call a judge. Because, you know, if your opponent just made a mistake, cool. They'll have it explained to them. They may get a warning. And it'll be a learning moment for them. A warning in and of itself doesn't do anything. It just says, hey, I've already talked to this person about this. And if you accrue too many warnings, they escalate into things like game losses and match losses and that kind of stuff, because you've already been informed that you were wrong. You know, it's a warning is pretty much a nudge to, like, hey, keep better track of your battlefield. And if you fail to do so, yeah, eventually that will escalate into something higher. But it's not really going to hurt them in any way if they're not trying to scum you. But it helps the judges be aware that, okay, you know, at Comp REL events like GPs and Opens, this stuff happens more because there's no barrier. You don't require an invitation. Put it that way. That sounds better. You don't require an invitation to those events. Anybody can register for it. Somebody who was issued their DCI card at an open house last week can register for an open. And they don't have those reps in the game. They don't have that time learning the more complex interactions that you especially see at that kind of level of play, because there's more on the line. And so they may end up in situations pretty frequently. But the thing is warnings escalate when you get the same warning over and over again. Usually for the same thing. So I generally encourage you to call a judge if you feel something's awry. And on the other side of that, you should never shame an opponent for calling judge. Like, I get if they're being shitty and they're like, dude, I totally know that I'm right and you're wrong. Well, they're shaming you for not bowing down to them. And they're like, well, I'm going to call judge. Okay, cool, you do that. You know, it's like when somebody's trespassing at your house and you're like, get the fuck out. And they're like, I'm going to call the cops. And you're like, cool, somebody really should. It's the same kind of scenario. It's shaming people for calling a judge. Again, I get if they're copping an attitude with you and everything. And I do understand that historically well, let's call the judge, has been used as a table bullying tactic. And if you're, say, going up against a more well-known player, this can be a little scary because, you know, the judge didn't watch the interaction. They're going to have to go on what you two say. And if there are players with certain reputations for twisting the truth, but it's like one of those not well-kept secrets, there's concern that the judge is going to side with them because they're the more well-known player. Now, granted, if that's a known behavior, any judge worth their salt is going to really scrutinize what they say, because it's a known tactic of theirs. But I can understand the concern there and everything. You shouldn't call a judge as, you know, a way to bully your opponent, ever, obviously. But I don't feel it's appropriate when you say, oh, like, phantasmal image. If it gets targeted, you have to sack it. It no longer is a legal target for the thing that was targeting it. That's how the card works. And I have had opponents pick bounce draw, targeting my phantasmal image, and then go to draw a card on a cryptic command. And I'm like, sorry, that's not how that works. You now no longer have any legal targets for the spell. It's like, oh, well, no, me. And I'm like, no, because it doesn't say target player. If it said target player draws a card, you'd be in the clear. But it's missing the keyword target. And Magic is just an obnoxious game of semantics, okay? When enters the battlefield is completely different as enters the battlefield. Even though in the general understanding of the English language, these things sound pretty similar. But they're very different in the context of Magic. And this is all in relation to, I think the guy's name is Mark. He's used a first name a few times, and I think it's Mark. It's something that begins with an M. He runs the Serving Sucks account. Dynamo Nesco, I think, is the handle. And generally, I enjoy his stories. I did my time in retail. I did my time in food service. And, yeah, it sucks. And the story he did in his normal storytelling metric for how he tells these stories of interactions he has with people in his serving life, or in his serving occupation. Yeah, that was a crappy way to say that. Sorry. And he followed the same kind of pattern. And generally the guy seems like an okay guy. Like, yeah, he may get a little next level with people who get pissy with him on Twitter. He can be a little abrasive, and, you know, I love abrasive people. But in general, he seems like a pretty good guy. So I just kind of get the feeling that the story was told in the way it was told because it's his general storytelling methodology. And I really wanted to comment directly on it, and honestly, I probably would have overlooked the initial post had I not read some of the replies to it that really seem to indicate people feel being abusive to players who want to call a judge to adjudicate an interaction because they don't understand it the same way you do. You know, that this is acceptable behavior, and it's not. Okay, it really fucking isn't. So, yeah, I might have just like, this is not one of my favorite ones from you, and just kind of moved on. But some of these replies seem to feel emboldened to, act this way because of this post. And I was going to reply to him, and then I thought, like, I just don't want to deal with his following. Like, because I really think from him, the worst I would get is either a lack of response or this has been dramatized, because this is kind of how this account works. But honestly, just based on seeing his interactions on Twitter and everything, I kind of anticipate the reply would have been more along the lines of, I didn't see it that way. I see what you're saying, and you're right. I agree. It's not acceptable to, be douche to people who want a judge to do their job. But people's followings sometimes defend their champion with an overzealous fervor, and their champion can do no wrong, and I just don't want to deal with it. And yeah, that's probably pretty prissy of me, and I probably should just suck it up and comment on the actual thread, but I subtweeted. And I did, because Cody replied and asked what I was talking about, so I linked to the tweet. And I did explain that I understand it follows his general storytelling metric. However, based on some of the replies, this seems to condone this mentality. And, I mean, don't get me wrong. I get that it's a good feeling. Like, when you understand this interaction so completely and you're like, I know I'm right. And your opponent's like, I don't know, like, that doesn't seem right to me, let's call a judge. And the judge rules in your favor, and it's that feeling of validation. Like, yeah, I do know what the hell I'm talking about. It's awesome. I do understand that. And that's why I say, like, I can definitely, I would give him the benefit of the doubt that the way this is written out is more in line with, like, making it fit his general storytelling dynamic, rather than he was as much of a tool towards this opponent as the way this is written indicates. But again, it's sometimes, especially when you've amassed a larger following, you kind of have to take that step and think. It's like, there was the hubbub, was that last week or the week before, about the guy who was comboing off on Moto. Oh man, I can't remember the guy's name. A lot of people came to his defense because, somebody retweeted his tweet where he's dunking on his opponent for making him go through the combo and everything. And it's like, and their stance was, you're being awfully aggressive about this, because they did seem to be being pretty aggressive about it. And a lot of people came to this person's defense and say, hey, this was a moment of weakness. I guess the guy has an injury, like an old injury. He has wrist pain. So clicking through all the iterations actually becomes physically painful to him. And hey, I get that. And I totally understand that. Like, I have tendonitis, probably working on a case of carpal tunnel because, I've been in IT for like a billion years. So, I mean, I can appreciate that. I really can. But at the same time, like, I do have to say, like, you're kind of the person who chose to play that deck, though. And, maybe this is something we should look at. Okay, let me pause here real quick. But, that's an accessibility thing that maybe, we should look at. Is there a way to write a macro to go through the iterations or something? Is there's some tool that can be developed to help with that? Because that is a very legitimate complaint, and I don't really feel right saying, well, if the best deck is in the format is a combo deck and you have a mobility issue in your hand, to prevent you from being able to effectively play it online without causing yourself pain, maybe you just shouldn't play that deck, because that's a really ableist point of view of, well, you chose to take the hard path. Well, I chose to take the hard path because I didn't really have another option. So again, maybe, I should take a look at once my new rig gets here and I can get Moto, if we can, if there's a way to like write macros to go through this, because that's like a whole different issue that needs solved. And so again, I can understand his frustration. I can understand when you are in physical pain, it makes you kind of irritable. And that maybe he went through this post like right after this match. His wrist is on fire, he's hurting, and it's just making him as sour as a tiger with a thorn in his paw. And I can totally understand that, but the general sentiment, and if you went through this thread, you would see the people replying, well, people need to learn how to scoop to combos and this and that. And that's what really bothers me there, is this assumption that a combo player is entitled to a concession from their opponent. You are never entitled to a concession from your opponent. If you choose to play the dirtiest freaking deck in the format, that's main win con is your opponent gets sick of playing against it, and you come across that opponent that's like, nah, I paid for 50 minutes plus 5 turns, we're going to play 50 minutes plus 5 turns. Unless you can kill me sooner. That's not on them to be required to concede to you. But because there are some prominent members of the community who, and I get, it sucks to watch it on coverage. It really does. It's just super obnoxious to watch somebody force somebody to go through the Nexus of Fate to Fairy Lock till they actually win the game on coverage. I do understand it, but one, coverage has a little leeway in what they pick to present on coverage, so maybe don't cover those matches. But two, it's not good for coverage, should never be a metric for determining what you do in a game or what cards are legal or anything else, because it really undermines the integrity of the game. And, this whole like, oh, you're holding out for your one out. Well, if I still have an out, I still have an out. Now, don't get me wrong. I enjoy smoking cigarettes between rounds. So, yeah, I scooped combo players. Like, ain't nobody got time for that. Once I realize I'm like 90% to lose the game, like, I may go through 1 or 2 draw steps to see if I can find the out I'm looking for. And if I don't, just say, let's screw it. I'm not coming back from this. But that doesn't mean I get to run around telling everybody that they should do as I do. And there's a lot of people, and a lot of them that have a lot of followers, that do go around and like, people need to learn when to concede, and, this is crap, and we love playing out the combo, so you're not punishing us. Okay, well then be happy about it. Like, why are you complaining then? So, this elitist point of view in Magic is something that the community has been, for a while, actively speaking against. And saying, hey, we can't have this, well, you're not male, so why do you belong here? Why do you feel entitled to be here? Or, other gatekeepery bullshit. And shaming somebody over using a metric in the game. And I understand that there's, like, some scummy things you can do that still technically aren't against the rules. Like, apparently, there is absolutely no consequence for being caught stream sniping. It's looked at as, the risk you run when you choose to stream your games. That's scummy. I disagree with that practice. I disagree with chalice checking. It is one thing if you, like, forget that the effect is on the battlefield. and your opponent also forgets, and like you realize 3 turns later and you're like, whew, got away with that one. But to actively cast a 1-drop into a Chalice on 1, hoping your opponent misses it, I don't know. Personally, I feel that's pretty scummy, but it is within the rules. And people seem to feel that this is a completely up and up thing to do. I'm gonna pause y'all again real quick. Again, I only warn you that I'm pausing you. Like, I know you don't experience the dead space, but I can't remember exactly what I was talking about when I left, so. But when you have a larger following, and I understand that a lot of these things come from a place of frustration, like you just had to sit and play out 75 turns of the Nexus to Fairy Lock until you got whatever you get to win the game. And it's frustrating and it's annoying, but it was the best deck in Standard at the time, so if your job was to win games, it was what you were playing. So I get that these things come from a place of annoyance and frustration. And I kind of feel like maybe people in the community that have a large amount of followers, because they're prominent members of the community, having a more private account with a more select group of followers to kind of put this kind of stuff out there to like vent these frustrations may be a good way to go, because unfortunately, and the thing is we saw the same kind of logic when it pertained to Jeremy from MTG headquarters on Sleep Media, the quartering, whatever other channel he's got going on, in that, no, he never, from the content I saw, and I will say that I did not go through all of his archives and watch all of his videos, because I didn't love him that much. I didn't even like him that much. But from the content I saw, he did not ever encourage people to harass or, dox or, any of these things that followers of his did. But end of the day, it came down to, you said these horrible things and whipped these people up into a frenzy and set them loose, and they harassed this person. And because you put that out there, and because these are your followers, and because you have a responsibility, he can be held accountable for that. And again, just to keep the record straight, I feel like going from no ban to a lifetime ban over saying mean things on the internet was excessive and kind of made the guy into a martyr. I also understand WotC was in a real crap position there. They had to respond to it, and they had to respond to it in a big way, and they had to set a line. I think they were a little aggressive about it, but, whatever. And I've always been clear on that stance, and it's not that I agree with him, it's not that I agree with things he said, it's not that I agree with the behavior, but I feel like when there was no rule pertaining to this, and he had been doing this for a very long time, and never been censured before, it may have been a bit aggressive. But in any case, it was determined that he could be held responsible for the behavior of his followers. And whether you feel that's right or wrong, we have... which lane do I think I want this lane. This is the lane we're going in. If we're going to set that standard, then I think, members of the community, especially ones that speak so much about wanting the community to be more accessible and being a kinder, softer, gentler community, and people just not be permitted to be assholes all the time, that sometimes they could do with taking a moment to think about what they're putting out there and how it's going to be interpreted and what behavior it's going to justify. Like, because the narrative has been for so long, people just need to learn to scoop to combo players. The guy who went on this tirade about having to go through this combo, was he empowered to feel like that this would be acceptable and in fact well received because this has been the narrative for so long? And judging by the comments on that thread, people who interacted with that thread, by and large, agreed with his behavior. It was only a couple other people that retweeted it with more of a censure on it, saying, dude, this isn't fucking cool. But how much does other prominent members of the community standing up and shaming people for not conceding when they feel they should empower and entitle this kind of behavior? And again, in that particular case, it just, because people responded on threads I was involved in with that, explaining why he may have had a lapse in control there and been unduly aggressive about this interaction. I do understand. I have problems with my back, and every once in a while I sleep on it wrong, or something happens that everything locks up. In fact, every morning when I get up, moving is incredibly painful until I get my joints to loosen up, because they stiffen up overnight. And it sucks. And it's fucking painful. Alright? No doubt, no lie, no question. And am I a little bitchier in the mornings when it's particularly bad? Yeah, absolutely. Am I a little feistier days where my back's super sore and tight and I can barely move? Totally. And, I'm fortunate that the people around me have generally been pretty understanding. And I do my best to control it and explain, I'm in a lot of pain and that makes me a bit snarky. So I'm trying real hard here, but just be aware, please. Because honestly, end of the day, your problems shouldn't grant you a pass for bad behavior, but there can be some understanding of circumstance. So I can get it if the guy was in pain and was like, this fucking guy, look at what this, this is bullshit and blah, 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 whatever, because he's in pain, he's a little overly reactionary, he's not taking the time to think through what he's putting out there, he's just putting it out there because he's pissed off. I can get that. And again, that comes down to a whole other issue that, okay, well, this is clearly a problem. So, is there a way to fix this problem? Is there a way to provide some kind of help for people in this situation? And then, of course, that also brings up, does this grant an unfair advantage when people who, say, don't require the mobility assistance use this? Because when you're playing a combo deck on Moto, apparently clock management is your fucking job. There's a lot of things to click through, and that's the consequence of playing that kind of deck. But so I'm not trying to call that guy, and again, I can't remember his name. I want to say that was also an M name, or maybe Zach. I don't know. I don't remember. I remember Danny Bolts is the guy who replied to me and was like, hey, I mean, I get what you're saying and stuff, but please understand there are some extenuating circumstances here. He's actually done a bit on why he hates when people make you click through this in Digital Magic, because of this old wrist injury and, the pain he suffers from. And I'm not trying to drag him over it, and I did say that the original person who shared the screenshots of it, kind of denouncing the behavior, there are certain behaviors that warrant attaching a name to it, mostly having to do with harassment or assault or things that put people in jeopardy. There are other times when you're trying to speak out against a behavior that attaching a name to it is excessive. and really seems like you're just trying to rally a war party to go after that person. In this particular case, I think redacting the name and more focusing on the behavior and the general mentality would have been more appropriate. And the original poster of the screenshots even conceded that, you know, perhaps it was impulsive of him to include the name and not black it out. Because, again, whoever the guy was that made that post, it's not actually just about him. It's that it's a behavior that's considered acceptable, and we need to kind of step up and say, you know what, maybe this shouldn't be considered acceptable. So again, the TLDR kind of thing here is, one, your opponent never owes you a concession. I will not only die on that hill, I will decompose and become a part of that hill. You are never owed a concession. If your deck takes 40 minutes to win a game, and your opponent refuses to concede, and you have to go through that 40 minutes to win the game, that's the deck you chose to play. I got stuck playing against this crap. But, again, me personally, no, I do tend to scoop to this kind of stuff unless my opponent's being, like, next level about stuff that I am willing to cut off my nose to spite my face and say, okay, looks like we're not smoking between rounds here, because we gotta sit here. You're gonna sit here and look at my stupid face until you actually win, just because your attitude has rubbed me the wrong way. But in general, no, I'll scoop that stuff because I do not have clock cycles in my life to waste on it. But I don't begrudge anybody who doesn't. And the other thing is, you should never shame your opponent for calling a judge. If you're, no matter how right you know you are, and hey, I get it, you know you're right. You absolutely know you're right. You've been told by a judge before that you're right. But you have to understand that when sitting down to a game of Magic, especially at comp or professional REL, your opponent can't necessarily trust your assertion of your being right, because you're both trying to win, and it's not exactly a secret that cheaters have been a problem in the competitive community. You know, we know it's happened. We're aware of it. You know, hell, we just had a really high-profile player go down. What was that, beginning of last year? Maybe the end of the year before? That was a well-respected, well-loved player and went down for marking his cards. Your opponent can't trust just you saying, no, I know I'm right. Like, okay, cool, you're right. It does no harm to you then to call the judge and have the judge tell your opponent you're right and explain how it works and give an official ruling. So I don't understand the mentality of, fine, you want to call a judge because you're stupid or whatever else goes on here. No, you have a disagreement about how this interaction works. You know you're right, cool. Your opponent thinks you're wrong, fine. Call a judge. If you're not trying to scum your opponent or pull anything over on them, I don't understand what your reluctance is to have the judge call. And I could be missing something there, and if I am, please let me know. You can email me lastpointgaming@gmail.com. You can @ me on Twitter @StrangerSparrow. You can DM me. You know, let me know if there's like a facet of this I'm missing, because I really can't see a reason why it is detrimental to you to have to call a judge. Especially, like, if it takes a while for a judge to get to you, and, you know, it's been observed that your hand's been up, but nobody's been able to get to you, or if the ruling takes a while to, you know, iron out and explain and everything, you'll get a time extension. So, like, there just really seems to be no downside to you when you know you're right to say, okay, well, let's have the judge explain it. You know, I want you to feel comfortable. Like I said, I've been in this position. You know, the one that comes to mind the most is it's a standard side event down at Nationals like 3 years ago now, I don't know, something like that. And yeah, I had the 2 Bomac Warriors. My opponent went to, you know, destroy one. And I sat and thought about it for a minute, and my hand was pretty worthless, and I had 2 red mana available. One I'd have to sting off of Ramian runes to get. I said, screw it, I'll just cash them both in. And, you know, he's like, well, you only end up with 1. And I'm like, no, hold on, I gotta think about how to explain this, because I shortcut this so much. And I get that. Sometimes when you shortcut stuff a lot, you know, you get to the point where having to think through explaining the timing of it is a little difficult. And, you know, the guy next to me starts in on, oh, she's right, and, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, no, do you want to call the judge? Let's just call the judge. He's like, do you mind? And I'm like, not at all. Let's call her over. And, you know, I want you to feel comfortable that I'm not trying to scum you. Like, no, I absolutely know I'm right. Because I can remember having the conversation with Cody about it. Because I'd actually, 2 F&Ms before that, went to cash in a Bomac Courier, and my opponent's like, well, in response, I'm going to, you know, Shatter Spell and destroy it. And I'm like, oh, fuck. Fine. And, like, it didn't even occur to me at the time, and I went to Cody, and I'm like, he couldn't do that, because part of the activation cost was to sack it, so it wouldn't have been there. And Cody's like, yup, you done played yourself. So, like, no, I knew I was 100% right that I could do what I was doing, because I'd been playing this deck for a couple weeks. I'd watched a lot of coverage on it. I watched a lot of Moto players playing it. I'd read a ton of articles. And, I mean, also I have a pretty good grasp on the rules of the game. So I knew I could do it. I just had to figure out how to explain it to him. And I don't think he was, you know, trying to scum me. I don't think he was gonna try to explain to the judge, like, in some weird way so that it looked like I was wrong. No, he literally, based on my impression of the interaction, thought what I was doing was wrong. And if that's the case, I would much rather have the tournament official come over and say, oh no, this is how this works, so that they can feel secure that I'm not trying to screw him over. And don't get me wrong, there have been times that I've been like, no, I think I'm right, let's call the judge, and I've been wrong. Now, not so much in recent years, but back when I first started playing organized play again, first started playing organized play for the first time, which is much different than playing around, you know, the desks at school or the kitchen table. And, you know, there have been times where I've been ruled against, you know, I was wrong, and I learned something from it, and cool, we move on. Like, but don't shame people for calling judges, but also don't use judges as a mechanic for, like, somehow bullying your opponent. Like, it's just rude, okay? Just heckin' rude. And I do understand, like, I have heard a lot of stories about certain players, especially players that are very prominent now, that in their more mid-level days, where they were first starting to reach that success, and I've seen a lot of players go through the noob phase of, okay, I don't wholly know what's going on all the time, and okay, yeah, you're probably right, and oh wait, no, they were wrong, and you build that skill and everything, and you start seeing some of that success, and it goes to your head a little bit, you get a little douchey, and then you hit, like, the real success level, and whoa, I could have reached out and touched that truck. You know, but, oh fuck it, I'll just say the name. I know I have been told by some, because, there are a lot of high-end pros that I enjoy following and I support, and Brad Nelson is one of them. And I know people have told me that there was a time where Brad was not very fun to play against, and not just because he was intense, but he was kind of a table bully. And he would do things like, do you want to call the judge? We'll call the judge. Let's get the judge over here. To shake his opponents and everything. And I personally believe Brad has moved on from this and has grown and developed as a player. I think he's a great person. I'm not trying to drag him or anything. But I understand that this behavior happens. Or at least has happened. And I still don't get the benefit of it. Because if the situation is explained honestly to a judge, they are going to rule in the correct manner, provided they don't themselves have a misunderstanding about the interaction, in which case at the higher level tournaments you can appeal to the head judge, and I imagine you don't get to be a head judge of one of those things without really knowing what you're talking about. Like, should I head judge an open? Probably not. That's actually, I think my rules knowledge is pretty good. I think the big thing is when it comes to judging at competitive REL, I have to remember that you have to issue warnings and shit. Because, I'm generally an F&M judge, so we don't have that as much. But in any case, it's never appropriate to shame your opponent for wanting a judge to do their job. Because a judge's job, by and large, is maintaining the integrity of the game in the tournament setting. And whether that means adjudicating rules misunderstandings or interaction misunderstandings and making rulings on that, or making sure that the environment is safe and secure for all the players there, not allowing harassment and bullying to happen under their watch. Not allowing, known cheaters to cheat because, I really like this person. A judge's job is to maintain the integrity of the tournament. And part of that is answering these questions. So, why you would take exception to somebody wanting to have the judge do their job so that they can feel secure that this interaction is happening appropriately and they're not just about to be screwed out of a win by you. I don't know. And just to reiterate one more time, I'm not trying to drag the guy from the Serving Sucks account. I have a lot of faith that that story was presented in the way it was because it is how he tells stories on that account. It's the expectation of the format. And maybe I give him a little more benefit of the doubt than I should because I happen to like the guy. Like, I follow him. I find him pretty funny. But it's not so much the original post as there are people who can't separate the, oh, this is like a dramatization kind of thing. It's more about the behavior that you're inadvertently, maybe not intentionally, kind of given a pass on and condoning, or people are perceiving that you're condoning this behavior that feeds into this elitist nonsense. So that's the by and large of it, kind of on the whole, my whole feelings on the matter. I don't want to come across as like oversensitive about things or anything, but I've seen it. I've seen people get shitty with their opponent for saying, I don't understand what you're saying here. Like, the way I understand this interaction works, I think you're wrong, and I would like to call the judge to get a ruling, and people get shitty and abrasive and abusive with them, and that shouldn't be tolerated. Because if you're getting all worked up over your opponent wanting to call a judge, like, if I'm playing against you and I'm like, I don't think that's how that works, let's call the judge, and you start getting aggressive and shitty with me, my assumption's going to be that you're trying to scum me, and that's why you don't want the judge getting involved. Because I can see no other benefit to you than you actively know you're wrong and that you're trying to mislead me, and you don't want a judge involved because you don't want that tick on your sheet. You don't want it made known to the tournament officials that you're pulling this shit. And maybe that's not the case, but again, I can see no other benefit to somebody getting all worked up over, I disagree with your interpretation of this interaction, and I would like to get the tournament official ruling. Because I think you're not correct. Then you know you're not correct, and you don't want the tournament official ruling because you know it's going to go against you. And again, that may not be the case, but that is going to be my perception of that behavior every single time, because I can see no other benefit to it. So, once again, if you know an angle to this that I don't, that you're like, no, see, you know, you have to understand XYZ, please, 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 please reach out to me. Comment on the YouTube if you're listening to us there. Comment on SoundCloud if you're listening to us there. You can email me. Again, Last Point Gaming, no spaces, no periods, no underscores or anything. Just run them together at gmail.com or at Stranger Sparrow. Both words spelled completely correctly per the English language. Again, no spaces, underscores, or anything like that. Just run them together. On Twitter, you can either DM me or you can just publicly at me, you know, whatever. Or you can respond to the tweet where I'm tweeting out the link to this episode. If there's an angle of this I'm missing, I would really like to know so that I can evaluate that and perhaps, if warranted, do a retraction. But based on my current perceptions and my experiences in the tournament world, limited as they may be, this is my thoughts on the matter. So, there we have it. As always, if you made it this far with me, I thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I'll talk to y'all on Wednesday, if not tomorrow.